10 seconds. Okay, stop reading. Don't look at the text. Talk to your partner and describe what you read and see how many similarities and differences you can find between the two texts. Okay? So summarize the text, find the similarities and the differences.
I can find one sentence out his name essay. He's 19 years old and his family is, and now he lives in the capital of Senegal or something like that. And now he has joined the other members of the family. So it was originated from Senegal and it hasn't originated from Senegal. It has a lot of ships and it's them.
Okay, let me stop you there. So you will have come across different similarities and differences. Two things. It's a very simple reading activity. Because normally if you saw this reading activity in a book, we would set true-false comprehension questions and all of that kind of thing. But what happens with this reading task is the student reads and then they make their own decisions about what is important to remember, and then they do the reading comprehension themselves. So it's a very authentic task. It's very context rich because the situation, the reading is about real people. It's not written specially for it, and so the students are dealing with something that's very authentic, very context rich. In terms of level, what level student do you think you could use that with? Pre-intermediate. Yeah? You might do some work with the vocabulary, but essentially pre-intermediate. So what we're getting here is a kind of pre-intermediate level text that's actually authentically quite high on the scale, and it's much more motivating if we can achieve that with a reading text. The other thing about the reading text, if I put both together, it makes quite a long text, but because my generation Y students are used to dealing with shorter texts, it's a way of breaking a text down into shorter pieces, so it's more manageable. What I can do next is say to the student, now read both texts and read and find the similarities and differences, but just breaking it down makes it reflect more how the kind of length of text that the students are reading. So it works on a number of levels that is quite important. Let's go back to our Generation Y students. Here they are with their gadgets. They're info addicts, they're multitasking, they're getting all of that lovely information that's on the internet. Unfortunately, the concern is that something is not happening here. In the past, we could pick up a nice big book on a subject, read it, it had been edited, the author had to quote the sources, they had to say where the information came from. Now, Bill and Betty, we'll call them here. Now they just go to their mobiles, they type in the information they want, and they get it from lots of different places. But they can't think critically about it because there's a problem with that way of gathering information. Just to illustrate the problem, here's a problem. Okay. Now, some of you will remember Mr. Bush. Some of you might be too young to remember because it's quite a long time ago now. If you don't remember Mr. Bush, President Bush I should say, I was living in the United States when President Bush was the president there. And there were lots of jokes about the intelligence level of President Bush, you'll probably remember. Yeah? So this was very funny because the vice president's wife had written a book called America, about the history of America, for 10-year-old children. And President Bush sat in the school while this 10-year-old read about the United States. And everybody, lots of people in America, particularly on the left, thought it was very funny because it demonstrated that President Bush couldn't actually read. But it wasn't true. This was the photograph that was taken, but then 2 weeks later the original photograph came out, the true photograph, which showed this. Now this was the actual real photograph which proved that President Bush could read books written for 10-year-old children. But what had happened was some left-wing politicians had taken the photograph and played with the camera and turned it upside down. My point is here that if students are gathering their information and they're reading off the internet, they need to be thinking critically about the sources and where it's come from, but also what the writer's position is. Does the writer have a political position? Do they come from a particular country? What is their world view? And the problem with gathering all this information from the internet, it's very hard to judge it. And I think that learners are judging it less and less than perhaps they were in the past. So it means we have a responsibility to help them with critical thinking. Here's a very simple activity you could use in class to help with critical thinking. In one of the levels of life, we've got a unit on languages, and we look at the fact that languages are dying out. And one of the readings is about some North American Indians who are trying to save their language. So they've set up classes, they're teaching their children their old language called Salish. They're in the United States. Now you'll see that the reading text is pretty long. This is longer than you might see in some course books. But we wanted to use quite long texts, and on the page we have reading comprehension, we have vocabulary, some phrasal verb work, and then we have a feature called critical thinking. And in this particular reading what we did was take sentences out and get students to think about when does the author express their opinion and when do they state a fact. So here's a very simple activity that you could do with any long text to help students think critically. You've got this on the handout. There are 8 sentences. Decide if the sentence is a fact or if it's the author's opinion. Okay? Have a look at the 8 sentences on your handout and just do the exercise. Is it fact or opinion? It should be on your handout. That's fine. Okay, let's have a look. So number one, fact or opinion?
Fact.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Very sure?
99%.
I was sure. I thought it was a fact.
Nobody knows yet.
Well, the thing was, then I had an American in an audience one day, and he said, well, it wasn't a new continent. It was a new continent if you were a European, but it wasn't a new continent if you were already living there. And also, of course, they say now that the Vikings arrived 1,000 years ago in the United States. So it's kind of an interesting sentence because you first look at it and think, yep, fact, happy with that. But actually, there are questions there that come up. And instantly, you've got to consider, well, how much do we accept as fact or opinion if it comes off the internet? I would have said a fact. 2, a terrible part of history began. Yeah, I mean, the general view is that it was a terrible part of history, but it's got an adjective in it which makes it slightly opinionated. I think one of the interesting things about this exercise, you know that we teach our students when they write articles, we say use phrases like, in my opinion, I think, ... and all of that in the writing. In fact, if you read opinionated articles, they don't use those phrases at all. They do things like put in adjectives in order to express an opinion. I'll just wait for the... Okay. Number 3, I feel fairly secure as a fact. I need to know where the information came from, but it's factual. Number 4 is factual. Number 5 is a really nice example where students can learn a phrase to use in their own writing. So instead of saying in my opinion or I think, they can learn a phrase like the good news is that, which makes it an opinion. The Salish tribe is an excellent example. Again, we get the use of the adjective there to express an opinion. Number 7 is factual. Number 8 kind of starts as a fact, and then halfway through the writer inserts his opinion and adds the adverb, hopefully, with the dashes just to make it more of an opinion. Very easy exercise to design with any long text, but I think particularly useful to get students thinking about the position of the writer. And you can only do it with texts that are quite authentic because they generally have opinions in there, but you have to look for the opinion. And useful for academic English. So critical thinking. The third point I wanted to talk about was integrating reading into other skills and other media. We don't read text in isolation, we read it with video or we read it online and so on. What we've done in life is we include reading texts, but we also combine them with video pages where students get the DVD and then they do some exercises linked with video. And what we wanted to do here was link the use of video with the use of reading, so that students were reading a text and then watching a video about it, so the two things were integrated. Okay. I'm going to show you an example of one of the videos that we used. I don't think you have the handout. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play you just part one of the videos that we use where the student watches the video and then they also read about the topic in the video as well. But you can see how the video would be used in class with a reading text. This one is called Butler